I'm here to talk about a process that's been ongoing for about 5 years now, where we're looking at, with all the fish community changes and trophic level changes going on in Lake Michigan, I was asked by the Lake Michigan Committee of the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, and that's made up of all the policymakers of the management agencies on Lake Michigan. I was asked to lead a task group, a multi-agency task group, to look at, we were charged with looking at the feasibility of restoring native planktivores, and what I'm talking about here is cisco and deepwater ciscos or chubs. And we were tasked to identify opportunities for promoting the restoration, certainly giving, in light of the changes that have been going on in Lake Michigan, and then to develop a white paper to deliver to them so that they could make final decisions on which way they want to move on this issue. And that includes doing nothing at all or adopting whatever we recommend or seeking their own path. So I'm going to grab this out of here. So the members of the Planktivore Task Group are listed here. I was asked to be the chair. So we have a broad spectrum of participants from all agencies and nonprofits, including Michigan DNR and the Michigan Sea Grant Program. And then here's the Lake Michigan Committee that basically we are responsible for delivering the white paper too. That we're doing this for them at their request. So just to clarify that this is not just a service, Fish and Wildlife Service process or initiative. This is instigated by the Lake Committee itself. So, I can't recall whether I've given this talk to you guys or not. In the last 2 years, I've been asked by a number of sportsmen's groups around Lake Michigan to give this talk. So bear with me if you've seen this before, but here's the animals we're talking about. So Lake Michigan and Lake Huron had one of the largest groups of these deep water ciscos. These are the chubs. We all remember smoked chubs. In Lake Michigan, there were 6 different forms of them. And they varied in size from the largest, which was the blackfin, to the smallest, which was actually the bloater, which is the only one that's left. And these were found in Lakes Michigan and Huron. And then all the Great Lakes had the cisco, which was ubiquitous to all the Great Lakes. This is what we call the lake herring. I think everybody knew it as lake herring. So this animal was found in all the Great Lakes, and it occupied both shallow and deep water, whereas these guys pretty much were found in deep water. So historically, here was the distribution of these forms across the entire Great Lakes. Certainly the highest diversity in Lakes Michigan and Huron, lowest diversity in Lake Erie, where you only had cisco and short-jaw cisco, and then intermediate diversities in Lakes Michigan and, Lakes Ontario and Superior. This is what we have now. So where you had highest diversity, you basically only have ciscos in Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, and some bloater. Nothing really going on in Lake Erie. They've lost pretty much everything. They do run into a few fish here and there. Those seem to be bloater that are coming downstream from Lake Huron. There's a few cisco populations left in northeast Lake Ontario. Lake Superior is the only lake that has basically had its complex survive, although the relative abundance of each form has changed. Still quite a few lake herring, or cisco. The short jaw chub was historically the most abundant, but now that's become the least abundant. So quite a loss of diversity, certainly a loss of biomass, a significant amount of biomass. And these were the forage fishes prior to the introductions of alewife and rainbow smelt. So what did these do? These were kind of the energy movers and shakers. They converted plankton and vertebrate production into fish biomass for consumption by lake trout and other predators. These were some of the largest lake trout populations in the world. And they fed Atlantic salmon in Lake Ontario. And in the case of Cisco, or lake herring, they also transferred energy from offshore areas to nearshore areas through their egg deposition in the fall. And these eggs stayed on bottom all winter long and provided food to other fishes in the form of eggs until they hatched out in the spring. So a lot of things feed on these eggs. Whitefish, suckers, Ciscoes themselves in Lake Ontario, you see lake trout feeding on them, and they're there all winter long. So, and there was a lot of these Ciscoes. They played a numbers game in terms of reproduction. They laid their eggs in a lot of different places, near shore, offshore, rivers. They occupied a lot of different habitats. Currently, some of the largest Cisco populations in Lake Superior spawn offshore in 200 feet of water. I know a guy who makes his living, he goes out to the shipping channel north of Devil's Island in the Apostle Islands in 35 fathom of water, and he's catching spawning Cisco. So these things were used a lot of different habitats historically. And there were a lot of them. So historically, here's the harvest in the upper lakes. This is Cisco and deepwater Ciscoes together. You can see everything started to go downhill in the 50s. There was virtually unregulated harvest. There was interactions with non-native species. Basically, by the end of the 60s, they were only at a fraction of what they were historically. And during this time period, this allowed alewife and smelt to basically replace them. So non-native forage fish came in, replaced these native ones, and supported this great multi-million-dollar sport fishery that you've been enjoying the last 30, 40 years. So the reasons for the declines: overfishing. We had sequential fishing up of the deep water forms from the largest to the smallest by reducing the commercial fishermen reducing their mesh sizes to catch even smaller and smaller ones. And then we had the removal of the keystone predator at one time. This is before salmon, which was lake trout, which basically destabilized these lower trophic levels. And this is a classic ecological problem that's occurring worldwide. We had the effects of exotics. Sea lamprey predation on some of the largest Ciscoes, like that, the blackfin Cisco. That was a big Cisco. It was a whitefish-sized Cisco. And then we had potential competition for food and space, and maybe even predation on Cisco larvae by rainbow, smelt, and alewives. We had habitat degradation. You had a lot of pollution going into the rivers, into the embayments where Cisco spawned. It created these high biological oxygen demands that basically smothered the eggs that were laid in the fall and basically smothered them over winter. And this certainly contributed to the first declines in Lake Erie, and certainly in Saginaw Bay and Lake Huron, and likely in Green Bay as well. So, opportunities for reintroduction we think exist now. Why? Unfortunately, alewife and rainbow smelt biomass is at all-time low, and that's likely going to stay. We've heard about the trophic level changes. Ben set this up perfectly. These animals may not be able to survive under those oligotrophic conditions that we have now. So therefore, an alternate forage is needed to support not only salmon, but also lake trout and everything else. You need something that could use the existing invertebrate forage base that's out there now. And we think it's Cisco's. Commercial fishery, which basically reduced a lot of that biomass, is much smaller, and it's well controlled, and is not going to return to its former levels. And luckily, we have some remnant populations left that could be used if reintroduction was deemed an option. And although we have lower productivity now than we did historically, we have zooplankton mysis communities that are still, we think, are adequate to support Cisco introduction. So why do you think I say that? So right now, we look at the zooplankton. Well, let me just go into this here. So there is no doubt that we have decreasing productivity. Ben showed us all this earlier. Basically, I'll go to the next one just to say. If you look at the zooplankton community of Lakes Huron, Michigan, and Superior in recent times, it all looks pretty much the same as Lake Superior. We've lost a lot of the smaller zooplankton species in terms of their numbers, but we've retained a high biomass of these limnacalinus. Now, limnacalinus is something Cisco can use. And even though the productivity is much lower now than it was historically, in Lake Superior, we support a lot of Cisco on this very same plankton, biomass, and species distribution. That's kind of the good thing. Even though things are not as good as what they were in Lake Michigan now, we have a situation that is supporting lots of Cisco and deepwater Cisco in Lake Superior. So the question is maybe we could do that in Lake Michigan. Mysis, which is that shrimp-like organism that Ben mentioned, that's still fairly abundant as well in Lake Michigan. Unfortunately, we don't have diaporia in the abundances that we used to. However, none of these animals that we're talking about were diaporia dependent. They fed on a lot of different things, including mysis and including those residual zooplankton that we still have today. And if you look at the estimates of abundance of Cisco across the lakes, you can see Lake Michigan, although we have these populations that are doing fairly well on the western side, on this shoreline, Lake Michigan's fairly empty of Cisco. Lake Huron has a few more, and Lake Superior certainly has the greatest biomass, and by no means do we think that was anywhere near what they were historically. So, strategies for recovery of these animals. There's really not that many things you can do. You can protect the animals that are left, and in Lake Michigan, that's bloater and deepwater, and Cisco that we see along this shoreline. You can protect them and wait and see what happens. You can reintroduce those species that were lost, or you still have source populations left in other lakes, and you can reintroduce those through a stocking program. There's others that think that habitat is a problem, and they would like to promote habitat improvement to basically help accelerate remnant stocks. I mean, I'm not picking one over the other. I'm just saying that's about all you can do. These are big lakes. These are big problems. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of buttons to push. So, ecological goal. What's the goal of all this if we're going to do this? That's basically to provide forage to salmon and trout, one. And secondly, ecologically, reestablish the energy transfer from deep water, offshore areas, to shallow waters and other trophic levels, and diversify a forage base that is able to use the existing invertebrate resources. And we saw what those are. There's a lot less than there were before, and the species composition just may match what Cisco can use as opposed to alewife and smelt. Long and short-term objectives is to provide a self-sustaining native forage base, and longer term would be to basically support some fisheries, certainly after you reestablish this ecological connection and you start feeding predators. So, because these are difficult problems, we've kind of put together this little conceptual model of what would be the easiest to do and what would be the hardest. And this is basically based on what we know about culture, what we know about source populations that are available. Certainly Cisco or lake herring would be the easiest, followed by Kai, which is a deep water, Cisco, which are very abundant in Lake Superior, but there's still a lot of things we have to learn about that. And you got some of these other deep water Ciscos where source populations are very small and very remote and very unlikely and difficult to actually access. And things are going on now. I mean, right now, we're in a program involved with reintroducing the bloater into Lake Ontario. For the last several years, our staff goes out with commercial fishermen on the Wisconsin side, and we gather chub eggs and milk and fertilize those eggs and send them off where they are sent to an Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources hatchery that services Lake Ontario and has built up a captive brood stock of bloater. And then production fish are expected to come off in subsequent years for reintroduction into Lake Ontario. There's also stocking programs to reintroduce lake herring into Lake Ontario. They do have some remnant populations in Lake Ontario, and there's some rearing going on there, as well as the activity that's going on here in Lake Michigan with the tribes raising fish that they're collecting gametes from in Grand Traverse Bay and reintroducing those in other areas of the lake, mostly along in Michigan waters. Those are small, very small programs, but certainly working out the bugs in the process. Europeans have been raising and stocking fishes like these for probably 25, 30 years now. I led a team of hatchery biologists from Michigan, New York, the service in Wisconsin, and the Ontario Ministry. We went over to Finland and looked at what they're doing over there. And they've been doing this a long time with one closely related species, the Vendus, and it's very doable. It's not impossible. It's just something that North Americans have had not a lot of experience with. So, when you're talking about reintroducing animals, there's a slew of genetic questions you have to really start thinking about and addressing. And I'm not going to weigh it down with a lot of this stuff here, but you have to look at things like genetic diversity and effective population size. What are the best donor populations? And things like that. And these are things that we're struggling with in the committee. And we've engaged some geneticists to help us answer some of these questions. But we think that the best donor populations have these characteristics. High genetic diversity. They come from the same habitat type and have the same behavior as those that you want to reintroduce. We know historically what some of these populations look like and what they may have behaved like. And basically it's these forms that lived in deep offshore waters, that those were the most predominant Cisco that were there historically. Whether we can recreate that or not, we don't know, but those populations do exist in other lakes. Ones that present no disease risks. You certainly don't want to be bringing in new diseases into a lake from an outside donor population, but that's handled through standard hatchery practices. Populations that are large enough to support routine egg collections. A lot of the remnant populations are actually too small to do that. You've got to be careful that you're not affecting them. And it's got to be logistically feasible. You've got to be able to get out, catch a large numbers of fish throughout the entire spawning run, and handle enough pairs to make sure you're adequately representing the genetics of that donor population in the young that you're reintroducing. So, we've packaged for Cisco, for the Lake Michigan Committee, for them to consider several options for Cisco reintroduction. And like I said, they have not made any decisions on this. They have yet to receive our report. Jay's totally been involved in this for a number of years. They have yet to make any decisions or even discuss this in any detail. But the first option would be, don't do anything at all. Just wait. The benefits of that is there's no genetic risk. You don't have to worry about introducing genetic material that may affect your resident populations. This would certainly, by not doing anything, allow a better understanding of population expansion and recovery, which is something Jory's going to report on after I do. The risks are marginal, or you could have no increases in stock size or management. That's one thing you're risking. It's feasible because you don't have to do anything. Informational needs. You'll see informational needs on all these, but basically, we need to document where other populations are in Lake Michigan. Right now, Jory and her team has done a good job of looking at the biology and distribution of the remnant populations in Michigan waters. There may be other ones out there on the Wisconsin and Illinois side. We haven't seen any evidence of them, but more work is needed. And certainly, we need to compare the observations that we see now with those of the historic information on Lake Michigan populations. Option B, if you're going to have a reintroduction program, use existing eggs only from Lake Michigan. Don't go outside there. Benefits are no genetic risks, and the residual populations may provide an adaptive advantage over other stocks because they've survived. There's no disease transfer issues, and we assume that the gamete sources are reliable in terms of numbers. The risks with that are that Lake Michigan populations may have less genetic diversity. The genetic diversity of all the remnant populations across the Great Lakes has been measured. They're all fairly similar, but the ones in Lake Michigan seem to be a little bit less genetically diverse. You have a possibility of inbreeding depression, where if you're stocking on top of an existing population and you're not careful of how you collect your gametes, you could have a situation where you're actually reducing genetic diversity. And by just sticking with Lake Michigan populations, it eliminates the possibility of introducing any new genes or diversity into the system. And stocking on top of existing populations, if not done correctly, has the risk of reducing effective population size or inbreeding, as I said. Feasibility is very feasible. It's happening right now. It's been ongoing for 4 or 5 years now. Certainly there's information needs associated with that on all these. Option C is going outside Lake Michigan and going to larger populations such as Lake Superior, Lake Huron. That's basically kind of some of the two real possibilities because they come from large lakes. You have slightly higher genetic diversity, would provide reliable and consistent and maybe even logistically feasible sources for eggs. These could be accessed via commercial fishers, an independent sampling. There's a lot of fish there. And repeat sampling would pose no impact to those populations. These populations are, especially in Superior, are pelagic broadcast spawners, which basically is similar to what the dominant form was in Lake Michigan and throughout all the other Great Lakes with the exception of Lake Erie. Risks. There's hybridization risks leading to outbreeding depression where you could basically impact your existing populations, the genetics of them. But this could be reduced by stocking those fish away from Grand Traverse Bay where remnant populations exist. Feasible, could begin immediately. There's numerous large stocks that are already been available and could be candidates. Of course, you have disease status issues, but those can be handled through normal hatchery practices. And then there's this option D, and this is something that the geneticists that looked at this issue suggested that stocking eggs from a broad range of donor populations throughout the entire Great Lakes. Certainly that would maximize genetic diversity for natural selection to work on. You're basically taking advantage of all the potential genetic material out there. But there's logistical problems with that. The risks are outbreeding depression with existing stocks. Again, those could be minimized by stocking the fish, the reared fish, away from existing populations. Intermediates, though, may not be adaptable to local environments. Again, disease risk can be handled. It's logistically difficult. You're basically keeping track of all these different genetic strains in hatcheries. We just don't have the bricks and mortar to do that. And I don't see anybody building brand new hatcheries to accommodate any effort like this. And we really have no kind of standard operating procedure that identifies how we would do this. Not to say we couldn't do it, that couldn't be developed, but just the logistics of handling 8 to 10 different genetic stocks from all over the lakes and keeping them in a hatchery, people understand this is a nightmare. So, and then there's those who feel habitat restoration is what's needed. And this could be done in areas where improvements may increase local recruitment. It could benefit populations, certainly if we thought that was a limiting factor. There's certainly no biological risk because you're not bringing any genetics in. Certainly, but the problem is there's really no evidence that habitat is limiting in Lake Michigan. There has been habitat loss elsewhere, but not significantly in Lake Michigan. And the costs of this could be, well, this is a risk for all these activities. Costs could be excessive and could be wasted, especially if they don't work. Feasibility is situation dependent. There's already been a project that has been implemented by the Nature Conservancy. So information needs, habitat definitions, limitations, restoration potential needs to be assessed before you really inform these restoration projects. Cisco's used a variety of habitats. They spawned up rivers. Like I said, they spawned in deep water. They spawned in nearshore areas. I'm not convinced that restoration of habitat is really going to get us where we need to go. So we can talk about these other forms. The only This is a deep water chub. This is very abundant. This is the most abundant deep water chub in the Great Lakes. And they all live in Lake Superior. They were found in other lakes. They're extremely dense when you get out to about 40 fathoms, and the further you go, the more abundant they get and the bigger they get. Thing is, we don't know much about them in terms of when they become in reproductive readiness. Historically, in Ontario, they came into reproductive readiness in June. Reports from Lake Superior say they came in November. I've spent 15 years on Lake Superior, and I've seen kai with eggs in them throughout the entire season. Now, what do you do when you have something that's spawning like that? Where do you go and when to get eggs? So there's more we need to know about the reproductive ecology of this animal. There's lots of them, but the logistics of getting eggs and milk at the right time could be difficult. So blackfin cisco, there's some remnant populations in Lake Nipigon and some small lakes in the Algonquin Park region that were just recently discovered. Not much known about these animals, especially the Algonquin ones. Lake Nipigon probably has the greatest potential, but they basically, those populations, Lake Michigan, are in decline for some reason, but certainly could be used for reintroduction. But if we do anything, pretty soon the existing hatchery capacity is going to get saturated. So even if we did one of these and did it well, that's going to be a challenge.